Section 1 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Elisabeth, second Queen Regnant of England and Ireland. Chapter 1, Part 1. We now come to the most distinguished name in the annals of female royalty, that of the great Elizabeth, second Queen Regnant of England. The romantic circumstances of her birth, the vicissitudes of her childhood, and the lofty spirit with which she bore herself, amidst the storms and perils that darkened over her during her sister's reign, invested her with almost poetic interest as a royal heroine, before her title to the regal succession was ratified by the voice of a generous people, and the brilliant success of her government, during a long reign, surrounded her maiden diadem with a blaze of glory which has rendered her the most popular of our monarchs, and blinded succeeding generations to her faults. It is not, perhaps, the most gracious office in the world to perform, with strict impartiality, the duty of a faithful biographer to a princess so endeared to national pride as Elizabeth, and to examine, by the cold calm light of truth, the flaws which mar the bright ideal of Spenser's Gloriana and Shakespeare's fair vestal throned by the west. Like the wise and popular Augustus Caesar, Elizabeth understood the importance of acquiring the goodwill of that class whose friendship or enmity goes far to decide the fortunes of princes. The might of her throne was supported by the pens of the master spirits of the age. Very different might have been the records of her reign if the reasoning powers of Bacon, the eloquence of Sidney, the poetic talents of Spenser, the wit of Harrington, and the genius of Shakespeare had been arrayed against her, instead of combining to represent her as the impersonification of all earthly perfection, scarcely, indeed, short of divinity. It has truly been said, however, that no man is a hero to his valet de chambre, and it is impossible to enter into the personal history of England's Elizabeth without showing that she occasionally forgot the dignity of the heroine among her ladies in waiting, and indulged in follies which the youngest of her maids of honour would have blushed to imitate. The web of her life was a glittering tissue, in which good and evil were strangely mingled, and as the evidences of friend and foe are woven together, without reference to the prejudices of either, or any object than to show her as she was, the lights and shades must sometimes appear in strong and even painful opposition to each other, for such are the inconsistencies of human nature, such the littlenesses of human greatness. Queen Elizabeth first saw the light at Greenwich Palace, the favourite abode of her royal parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her birth was thus quaintly but prettily recorded by the contemporary historian, Hall. On the 7th day of September, being Sunday, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the queen was delivered of a fair lady, on which day the Duke of Norfolk came home to the christening. The apartment in which she was born was hung with tapestry representing the history of holy virgins, and was from that circumstance called the Chamber of the Virgins. When the queen her mother, who had eagerly anticipated a son, was told that she had given birth to a daughter, she endeavoured, with ready tact, to attach adventitious importance to her infant, by saying to the ladies in attendance, "They may now, with reason, call this room the Chamber of Virgins, for a virgin is now born in it on the vigil of that auspicious day on which the Church commemorates the Nativity of the Virgin Mary." Heywood, though a zealous eulogist of the Protestant principles of Elizabeth, intimates that she was under the especial patronage of the Blessed Virgin from the hour of her birth, and for that cause devoted to a maiden life. "The Lady Elizabeth," says he, "was born on the eve of the Virgin's nativity, and died on the eve of the Virgin's annunciation, even that she is now in heaven with all those blessed virgins that had oil in their lamps." Notwithstanding the bitter disappointment felt by King Henry at the sex of the infant, a solemn Te Deum was sung in honour of her birth, and the preparations for her christening were made with no less magnificence than if his hopes had been gratified by the birth of a male heir to the crown. The solemnization of that sacred rite was appointed to take place on Wednesday, the 10th of September, the 4th day after the birth of the infant princess. On that day the Lord Mayor, with the aldermen and the council of the City of London, dined together at 1 o'clock, and then, in obedience to their summons, took boat in their chains and robes, and rode to Greenwich, where many lords, knights, and gentlemen were assembled to witness the royal ceremonial. All the walls between Greenwich Palace and the convent of the Grey Friars were hung with arras and the way strewn with green rushes. The church was likewise hung with arras. Gentlemen with aprons and towels about their necks guarded the font, which stood in the middle of the church. It was of silver and raised to the height of 3 steps, and over it was a square canopy of crimson satin, fringed with gold. About it, a space railed in, covered with red say. Between the choir and the chancel, a closet with a fire had been prepared lest the infant should take cold in being disrobed for the font. When all these things were ready, the child was brought into the hall of the palace, and the procession set out to the neighbouring church of the Grey Friars, of which building no vestige now remains at Greenwich. The procession began with the lowest ranks. The citizens 2 and 2 led the way, then gentlemen, esquires, and chaplains, a gradation of precedence, rather decidedly marked, of the 3 first ranks, whose distinction is by no means definite in the present times. After them the aldermen, and the Lord Mayor by himself, then the Privy Council in robes, then the peers and prelates, followed by the Earl of Essex, who bore the gilt-covered basins, then the Marquis of Exeter, with the taper of virgin wax, next the Marquis of Dorset, bearing the salt, and the Lady Mary of Norfolk, the betrothed of the young Duke of Richmond, carrying the chrism, which was very rich with pearls and gems. Lastly came the royal infant, in the arms of her great-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, under a stately canopy which was supported by the uncle of the babe, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the Lords William and Thomas Howard, the maternal kindred of the mother, and Lord Hussey, a newly made lord of the Boleyn blood. The babe was wrapped in a mantle of purple velvet, with a train of regal length, furred with ermine, which was duly supported by the Countess of Kent, assisted by the Earl of Wiltshire, the grandfather of the little princess, and the Earl of Derby. On the right of the infant marched its great uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, with his marshal's staff; on the other, the Duke of Suffolk. The Bishop of London, who performed the ceremony, received the infant at the church door of the Grey Friars, assisted by a great company of bishops and mitred abbots. And with all the rites of the Church of Rome, this future great Protestant queen received the name of her grandmother, Elisabeth of York. Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, was her godfather, and the Duchess of Norfolk and Marchioness of Dorset her godmothers. After Elisabeth had received her name, Garter King-at-Arms cried aloud, God of his infinite goodness, send a prosperous life and long to the high and mighty Princess of England, Elisabeth. Then a flourish of trumpets sounded, and the royal child was borne to the altar. The gospel was read over her, and she was confirmed by Cranmer, who, with the other sponsors, presented the christening gifts. He gave her a standing cup of gold, the Duchess of Norfolk a cup of gold fretted with pearls, being completely unconscious of the chemical antipathy between the acidity of wine and the misplaced pearls. The Marchioness of Dorset gave 3 gilt bowls, pounced with a cover, and the Marchioness of Exeter 3 standing bowls, graven and gilt, with covers. Then were brought in wafers, comfits, and hippocras, in such abundance that the company had as much as could be desired. The homeward procession was lighted on its way to the palace with 500 staff torches, which were carried by the yeomen of the guard and the king's servants, but the infant herself was surrounded by gentlemen bearing wax flambeaux. The procession returned in the same order that it went out, save that 4 noble gentlemen carried the sponsors' gifts before the child, with trumpets flourishing all the way preceding them, till they came to the door of the queen's chamber. The king commanded the Duke of Norfolk to thank the Lord Mayor and citizens heartily in his name for their attendance, and after they had powerfully refreshed themselves in the royal cellar, they betook themselves to their barges. The queen was desirous of nourishing her infant daughter from her own bosom, but Henry, with his characteristic selfishness, forbade it, lest the frequent presence of the little princess in the chamber of her royal mother should be attended with inconvenience to himself. He appointed for Elizabeth's nurse the wife of a gentleman named Hocart, whom he afterwards ennobled, and he invested the Duchess Dowager of Norfolk with the office of state governess to the new-born babe, giving her for a residence the fair mansion and all the rich furniture which he had bestowed on Anne Boleyn when he created her Marchioness of Pembroke with a salary of 6,000 crowns. The lady Margaret Bryan, whose husband, Sir Thomas Bryan, was a kinsman of Queen Anne Boleyn, was preferred to the office of governess in ordinary to Elizabeth, as she had formerly been to the Princess Mary. She was called the Lady Mistress. Elizabeth passed the first 2 months of her life at Greenwich Palace, with the queen her mother, and during that period she was frequently taken for an airing to Eltham for the benefit of her health. On the 2nd of December she was the subject of the following order in council. The king's highness hath appointed that the lady princess Elizabeth, almost 3 months old, shall be taken from hence towards Hatfield upon Wednesday next week, that on Wednesday night she is to lie and repose at the house of the Earl of Rutland at Enfield, and the next day to be conveyed to Hatfield, and there to remain with such household as the king's highness has established for the same. Hertford Castle was first named, but scratched through and changed to Hatfield. A few weeks afterwards she became, in virtue of the Act of Parliament which settled the succession, in default of heirs male to Henry VIII., on the female issue of that monarch by Anne Boleyn, the heiress presumptive to the throne, and her disinherited sister, the Princess Mary, was compelled to yield precedency to her. Soon after this change in the prospects of the unconscious babe, she was removed to the palace of the Bishop of Winchester at Chelsea, on whom the charge of herself and her extensive nursery appointments were thrust. When she was 13 months old she was weaned, and the preliminaries for this important business were arranged between the officers of her household and the cabinet ministers of her august sire, with as much solemnity as if the fate of empires had been involved in the matter. The following passages are extracted from a letter from Sir William Paulet to Cromwell on this subject. The king's grace, well considering the letter directed to you from my lady Bryan and other my lady princess's officers, his grace, with the assent of the queen's grace, hath fully determined the weaning of my lady princess to be done with all diligence. He proceeds to state that the little princess is to have the whole of any one of the royal residences thought best for her, and that consequently he has given orders for Langley to be put in order for her and her suite, which orders, he adds, this messenger hath withal a letter from the queen's grace to my lady Bryan, and that his grace and the queen's grace doth well and be merry, and all theirs, thanks be to God. From Sarum, October 9th. Scarcely was this nursery affair of state accomplished before Henry exerted his paternal care in seeking to provide the royal weanling with a suitable consort, by entering into a negotiation with Francis I of France for a union between this infant princess and the Duke of Angoulême, the third son of that monarch. Henry proposed that the young duke should be educated in England, and stipulated that he should hold the duchy of Angoulême independently of the French crown, in the event of his coming to the crown of England through his marriage with Elizabeth. The project of educating the young French prince, who was selected for the husband of the presumptive heiress of England, according to the manners and customs of the realm of which she might hereafter become the sovereign, was a sagacious idea, but Henry clogged the matrimonial treaty with conditions which it was out of the power of the King of France to ratify, and it proved abortive. The tragic events which rendered Elizabeth motherless in her 3rd year, and degraded her from the lofty position in which she had been placed by the unjust and short-lived paternal fondness of her capricious father, have been fully detailed in the memoir of her unhappy mother, Anne Boleyn. By the sentence which Cranmer had passed on the marriage of her parents and her own birth, Elizabeth was branded with the stigma of illegitimacy, and that she was for a time exposed to the sort of neglect and contempt which is too often the lot of children to whom that reproach applies, is evidenced by the following letter from Lady Bryan to Cromwell, imploring for a supply of necessary raiment for the innocent babe who had been so cruelly involved in her mother's fall. My lord, after my most bounden duty, I recommend me to your good lordship, beseeching you to be good lord to me, now in the greatest need that ever was. For it hath pleased God to take them from me that was my greatest comfort in this world, to my great heaviness. Jesu have mercy on my soul. And now I am succourless, and as a redless, or without redress, creature, but only from the great trust which I have in the King's grace and your good lordship. For now in you I put all my whole trust of comfort in this world, beseeching you to me that I do so. My lord, when your lordship was last here, it pleased you to say that I should not mistrust the King's grace nor your lordship, which word was more comfort to me than I can write, as God knoweth. And now it boldeth or emboldens me to show you my poor mind. My lord, when my Lady Mary's grace was born, it pleased the King's grace to appoint me lady mistress, and made me a baroness, and so I have been governess to the children his grace have had since. Now it is so, my Lady Elisabeth is put from that degree she was afore, and what degree she is at of now, I know not, but by hearsay. Therefore I know not how to order her, nor myself, nor none of hers that I have the rule of, that as her women and grooms, I beseech you to be good lord to my lady, and to all hers, and that she may have some raiment. Here Strype has interpolated a query for mourning. There is nothing of the kind implied in the original. If Strype had consulted any female on the articles enumerated, he would have found that few indeed of them indeed were requisite for mourning. The list shows the utter destitution the young princess had been suffered to fall into in regard to clothes, either by the neglect of her mother, or because Anne Boleyn's power of aiding her child had been circumscribed long before her fall. Let any lady used to the nursery read over the list of the poor child's wants, represented by her faithful governess, and consider that a 12-month must have elapsed since she had a new supply. She, continues Lady Bryan, hath neither gown nor kirtle, or slip, nor petticoat, nor no manner of linen, nor foresmocks or day chemises, nor kerchiefs, nor rails, or night dresses, nor body stitchets, or corsets, nor handkerchiefs, nor sleeves, nor mufflers, or mob caps, nor biggins, or nightcaps. All these her grace must take. I have driven off as long as I can, that by my troth I can drive it off no longer. Beseeching you, my lord, that ye will see that her grace may have that which is needful for her, as my trust is that you will do. Beseeching ye, mine own good lord, that I may know from you, by writing, how I shall order myself, and what is the King's grace's pleasure and yours, and that I shall do in everything? And whatsoever it shall please the King's grace or your lordship to command me at all times, I shall fulfil it to the best of my power. My lord, Mr. Shelton, a kinsman of Anne Boleyn, said he be master of this house. What fashion that may be I cannot tell, for I have not seen it afore. My lord, ye be so honourable yourself, and every man reporteth that your lordship loveth honour, that I trust you will see the house honourably ordered, as it ever hath been aforetime. And if it please you that I may know what your order is, and if it be not performed, I shall certify your lordship of it. For I fear me it will be hardly enough performed. But if the head, evidently Shelton, knew what your honour meaneth, it will be the better ordered. If not, it will be hard to bring to pass. My lord, Mr. Shelton would have my Lady Elisabeth to dine and sup every day at the board of estate. Alas, my lord, it is not meet for a child of her age to keep such rule yet. I promise you, my lord, I dare not take it upon me to keep her grace in health and she keep that rule. For there she shall see divers meats and fruits and wine, which it would be hard for me to restrain her grace from. Ye know, my lord, there is no place of correction there, and she is yet too young to correct greatly. I know well, and she be there, I shall neither bring her up to the King's grace's honour, nor hers, nor to her health, nor to my poor honesty. Wherefore I shall show your lordship this my desire, beseeching you, my lord, that my lady may have a mess of meat at her own lodging, with a good dish or two that is meet or fit for her grace to eat of, and the reversion of the mess shall satisfy all her women, a gentleman usher, and a groom, which be 11 persons on her side. Sure am I it will be as great profit to the king's grace this way, namely, to the economy of the arrangement, as the other way. For if all this should be set abroad, they must have 3 or 4 messes of meat, whereas this one mess shall suffice them all, with bread and drink, according as my lady Mary's grace had afore, and to be ordered in all things as her grace was afore. God knoweth my lady Elisabeth hath great pain with her great teeth, and they come very slowly forth, which causeth me to suffer her grace to have her will more than I would. I trust to God and her teeth were well graft, to have her grace after another fashion than she is yet, so as I trust the king's grace shall have great comfort in her grace. For she is as toward a child and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life. Jesu preserve her grace. As for a day or two, at a high time, meaning a high festival, or whensoever it shall please the king's grace to have her set abroad, or shown in public, I trust so to endeavour me, that she shall so do as shall be to the king's honour and hers, and then after to take her ease again. That is, notwithstanding, the sufferings of the young Elisabeth with her teeth, if the king wishes to exhibit her for a short time in public, Lady Bryan will answer for her discreet behaviour, but after the drilling requisite for such ceremonial, it will be necessary for her to revert to the unconstrained playfulness of childhood. Lady Bryan concludes with this remark: I think Mr. Shelton will not be content with this. He need not know it is my desire, but that it is the king's pleasure and yours that it should be so. Good my lord, have my lady's grace, and us that be her poor servants, in your remembrance. And your lordship shall have our hearty prayers, by the grace of Jesu, who ever preserve your lordship with long life, and as much honour as your noble heart can desire. From Hunsdon, with the evil hand, or bad writing, of her who is your daily beadwoman, Margaret Bryan. I beseech you, mine own good lord, be not miscontent that I am so bold to write thus to your lordship, but I take God to my judge, I do it of true heart, and for my discharge, beseeching you, accept my good mind. Endorsed to the right noble and my singular good lord, my lord privy seal, be this delivered. This letter affords some insight into the domestic politics of the nursery palace of Hunsdon at this time. It shows that the infant Elisabeth proved a point of controversy between the 2 principal officials there, Margaret Lady Bryan and Mr. Shelton, both placed in authority by the recently immolated Queen Anne Boleyn, and both related to her family. Her aunt had married the head of the Shelton or Skelton family in Norfolk, and this officer at Hunsdon was probably a son of that lady, and consequently a near kinsman of the infant Elisabeth. He insisted that she should dine and sup at a state table where her infant importunity for wine, fruit, and high-seasoned food could not conveniently be restrained by her sensible governess, Lady Bryan. Shelton probably wished to keep regal state as long as possible round the descendant of the Boleyns, and, in that time of sudden change in royal destinies, had perhaps an eye to ingratiate himself with the infant by appearing in her company twice every day, and indulging her by the gratification of her palate with mischievous dainties. Lady Bryan was likewise connected with the Boleyn family, not so near as the Sheltons, but near enough to possess interest with Queen Anne Boleyn, to whom she owed her office as governess or lady mistress to the infant Elisabeth. There can scarcely exist a doubt that her lamentations and invocation for the soul of the same person lately departed, by whose death she was left succourless, referred to the recent death of Anne Boleyn. It is evident that if Lady Bryan had not conformed to King Henry's version of the Catholic religion, she would not have been in authority at Hunsdon, where she was abiding not only with her immediate charge, the Princess Elisabeth, but with the disinherited Princess Mary. Further, there may be observed a striking harmony between the expressions of this lady and those of the Princess Mary, who appealed to her father's paternal feelings in behalf of her sister the infant Elizabeth, a few weeks later, almost in the same words used by Lady Bryan in this letter. A coincidence which proves unity of purpose between the governess and the Princess Mary regarding the motherless child. Much of the future greatness of Elizabeth may reasonably be attributed to the judicious training of her sensible and conscientious governess, combined with the salutary adversity which deprived her of the pernicious pomp and luxury that had surrounded her cradle while she was treated as the heiress of England. The first public action of Elizabeth's life was her carrying the chrism of her infant brother, Edward VI., at the christening solemnity of that prince. She was borne in the arms of the Earl of Hertford, brother of the Queen, her stepmother, when the assistants in the ceremonial approached the font. But when they left the chapel, the train of her little Grace, just 4 years old, was supported by Lady Herbert, the sister of Catharine Parr, as, led by the hand of her elder sister, the Princess Mary, she walked with mimic dignity, in the returning procession, to the chamber of the dying Queen. At that period, the royal ceremonials of Henry VIII's court were blended with circumstances of wonder and tragic excitement, and strange and passing sad it must have been to see the child of the murdered Queen, Anne Boleyn, framing her innocent lips to lisp the name of mother to her, for whose sake she had been rendered motherless, and branded with the stigma of illegitimacy. In all probability the little Elizabeth knelt to her, as well as to her cruel father, to claim a benediction in her turn, after the royal pair had proudly bestowed their blessing on the newly baptized prince, whose christening was so soon to be followed by the funeral of the Queen his mother. It was deemed an especial mark of the favour of her royal father, that Elizabeth was considered worthy of the honour of being admitted to keep company with the young prince her brother. She was 4 years older than he, and having been well trained and gently nurtured herself, was better able, says Haywood, to teach and direct him, even from the first of his speech and understanding. Cordial and entire was the affection betwixt this brother and sister, insomuch that he no sooner began to know her but he seemed to acknowledge her, and she, being of more maturity, as deeply loved him. On the 2nd anniversary of Edward's birth, when the nobles of England presented gifts of silver and gold and jewels to the infant heir of the realm, the Lady Elizabeth's Grace gave the simple offering of a shirt of cambric worked by her own hands. She was then 6 years old. Thus early was this illustrious lady instructed in the feminine accomplishment of needlework, and directed to turn her labours in that way to a pleasing account. From her cradle, Elizabeth was a child of the fairest promise, and possessed the art of attracting the regard of others. Wriothesley, who visited the two princesses, when they were together at Hertford Castle, December 17, 1539, was greatly impressed with the precocious understanding of the young Elizabeth, of whom he gives the pretty account. I went then to my Lady Elizabeth's Grace, and to the same made his Majesty's most hearty commendations, declaring that his Highness desired to hear of her health, and sent his blessing. She gave humble thanks, inquiring after his Majesty's welfare, and that with as great a gravity as she had been 40 years old. If she be no worse educated than she now appeareth to me, she will prove of no less honour than beseemeth her father's daughter, whom the Lord long preserve. The feelings of jealous dislike which the Princess Mary naturally felt towards her infant rival were gradually subdued by the endearing caresses of the innocent child when they became sisters in adversity. When Mary again incurred the displeasure of her capricious sire, and was forbidden to come within a certain distance of the court, Elizabeth became once more the associate of her little brother's sports, and afterwards shared his studies. The early predilection of these royal children for their learning was remarkable. As soon as it was light they called for their books, so welcome, says Haywood, were their ore matinute that they seemed to prevent the night's repose for the entertainment of the morrow's schooling. They took no less delight in the practice of the religious exercises and the study of the Scriptures, to which their first hours were exclusively devoted. The rest of the forenoon, continues our author, breakfast alone excepted, they were instructed in languages and science, or moral learning, collected out of such authors as did best conduce to the instruction of princes, and when he was called out to his more active exercises in the open air, she betook herself to her lute or viol, and when wearied with that, employed her time in needlework. On the marriage of the king her father with Anne of Cleves in 1540, the young Elizabeth expressed the most ardent desire to see the new queen, and to be permitted to pay her the homage of a daughter. When her governess made this request, in the name of her royal pupil, to the king, he is said to have replied, that she had had a mother so different from the queen, that she ought not to wish to see her, but she had his permission to write to her majesty. On which, the following letter, probably the first ever written by Elizabeth, was addressed by her to her new stepmother. Madam, I am struggling between two contending wishes. One is, my impatient desire to see your majesty; the other, that of rendering the obedience I owe to the commands of the king my father, which prevent me from leaving my house till he has given me full permission to do so. But I hope that I shall be able shortly to gratify both these desires. In the meantime, I entreat your majesty to permit me to show, by this billet, the zeal with which I devote my respect to you as my queen, and my entire obedience to you as my mother. I am too young and feeble to have power to do more than to felicitate you with all my heart in this commencement of your marriage. I hope that your majesty will have as much good will for me as I have zeal for your service. This letter is without date or signature, and Leti, who rarely gives his authorities, does not explain the source whence it was derived, but there is no reason to dispute its authenticity. He tells us that Anne of Cleves, when she saw Elizabeth, was charmed with her beauty, wit, and endearing caresses, that she conceived the most tender affection for her, and when the conditions of her divorce were arranged, she requested, as a great favour, that she might be permitted to see her sometimes, adding, that to have had that young princess for her daughter would have been greater happiness to her than being queen. The paternal pride of Henry was gratified at this avowal, and he agreed that she should see Elizabeth as often as she wished, provided that she was only addressed by her as the Lady Anne of Cleves. Elizabeth found no less favour in the eyes of her new stepmother, the young and beautiful Catharine Howard, who, being cousin german of her unhappy mother, Anne Boleyn, took the young princess under her especial protection, and treated her with every mark of tenderness and consideration. On the day that she was publicly acknowledged by Henry as his queen, she directed that the Princess Elizabeth should be placed opposite to her at table because she was of her own blood and lineage. It was also observed that at all the fetes and public shows which took place in the honour of her marriage with the king, Queen Catharine gave the Lady Elizabeth the place of honour nearest to her own person, saying, that she was her cousin. It was supposed that this partial stepmother intended to use her powerful influence with the king for the repeal of the Act of Parliament which had pronounced Elizabeth to be illegitimate, and thus she would have been given a second time the preference to her elder sister in the succession. Notwithstanding the favour which was shown to Elizabeth by the Howard queen, she was always entreating the king her father to allow her to remain with the Lady Anne of Cleves, for whom she ever manifested a very sincere regard. The attachments formed by Elizabeth in childhood and early youth were of an ardent and enduring character, as will be hereafter shown. After the disgrace and death of Queen Catharine Howard, Elizabeth resided chiefly with her sister Mary at Havering Bower. In the summer of 1543, she was present when Mary gave audience to the imperial ambassadors. She was then 10 years old. Soon after, King Henry offered her hand to the Earl of Arran for his son, in order to win his co-operation in his darling project of uniting the crowns of England and Scotland by a marriage between the infant queen, Mary Stuart, and his son, Prince Edward. Perhaps the Scottish earl did not give Henry credit for the sincerity of a proposal so derogatory to the dignity of the Princess Elizabeth, for he paid little attention to this extraordinary offer, and espoused the interest of the French court. According to Marillac, Henry had previously mentioned his intention of espousing Elizabeth to the infant of Portugal, but all Henry's matrimonial schemes for his children were doomed to remain unfulfilled, and Elizabeth, instead of being sacrificed in her childhood in some political marriage, had the good fortune to complete a most superior education under the auspices of the good and learned Catharine Parr, Henry's sixth queen and her fourth stepmother. Catharine Parr was well acquainted with Elizabeth before she became queen, and greatly admired her wit and manners. On her marriage with the king she induced him to send for the young princess to court, and to give her an apartment in the palace of Whitehall, contiguous to her own, and bestowed particular attention on all her comforts. According to Leti, Elizabeth expressed her acknowledgments in the following letter: Madam, the affection that you have testified in wishing that I should be suffered to be with you in the court, and requesting this of the king my father with so much earnestness, is a proof of your goodness. So great a mark of your tenderness for me obliges me to examine myself a little, to see if I can find anything in me that can merit it, but I can find nothing but a great zeal and devotion to the service of your majesty. But as that zeal has not yet been called into action so as to manifest itself, I see that it is only the greatness of soul in your majesty which makes you do me this honour, and this redoubles my zeal towards your majesty. I can assure you also that my conduct will be such that you shall never have cause to complain of having done me the honour of calling me to you. At least I will make it my constant care that I do nothing but with a design to show always my obedience and respect. I await with much impatience the orders of the king my father for accomplishment of the happiness for which I sigh, and I remain, with much submission, your majesty's very dear Elizabeth. There is no date to this letter, and as Elizabeth certainly was present at the nuptials of her royal father with Catharine Parr, it is more probable that it was written after the return of Henry and Catharine from their bridal progress, as she addresses the latter by her regal title. Elizabeth at that time was a child of extraordinary acquirements, to which were added some personal beauty and very graceful manners. She had wit at command, and sufficient discretion to understand when and where she might display it. Those who knew her best were accustomed to say of her, that God, who had endowed her with such rare gifts, had certainly destined her to some distinguished employment in the world. At the age of 12 she was considerably advanced in sciences, which rarely indeed at that era formed part of the education of princesses. She understood the principles of geography, architecture, the mathematics, and astronomy, and astonished all her instructors by the facility with which she acquired knowledge. Her handwriting was beautiful, and her skill in languages remarkable. Hentzner, the German traveller, mentions having seen a little volume in the royal library at Whitehall, written by Queen Elizabeth, when a child, in French on vellum. It was thus inscribed:
À très haut et très puissant et redouté prince Henri VIII, de ce nom, roi d'Angleterre, de France et d'Irlande, défenseur de la foi. Élisabeth, sa très humble fille, rend salut et obédience.
Among the royal manuscripts in the British Museum is a small volume, in an embroidered binding, consisting of prayers and meditations, selected from different English writers by Queen Catharine Parr, and translated and copied by the Princess Elizabeth, in Latin, French, and Italian. The volume is dedicated to Queen Catharine Parr, and her initials R.K.P. are introduced in the binding between those of the Saviour, wrought in blue silk and silver thread by the hand of Elizabeth. It is dated Hertford, December 20th, 1545. Camden also mentions a godly meditation of the soul concerning love towards Christ our Lord, translated by Elizabeth from French. Her master for the Italian language was Castiglione. Like her elder sister, the Princess Mary, she was an accomplished Latin scholar, and astonished some of the most erudite linguists of that age by the ease and grace with which she conversed in that language. French, Italian, Spanish, and Flemish she both spoke and wrote with the same facility as her native tongue. She was fond of poetry, and sometimes made verses that were not devoid of merit, but she only regarded this as the amusement of her leisure hours, bestowing more of her time and attention on the study of history than anything else. To this early predilection she probably owed her future greatness as a sovereign. Accomplishments may well be dispensed with in the education of princes, but history is the true science for royal students, and they should early be accustomed to reflect and draw moral and philosophical deductions from the rise and fall of nations, and to trace the causes that have led to the calamities of sovereigns in every age, for neither monarchs nor statesmen can be fitted for the purposes of government unless they have acquired the faculty of reading the future by the lamp of the past. Elizabeth was indefatigable in her pursuit of this queenly branch of knowledge, to which she devoted 3 hours a day, and read works in all languages that afforded information on the subject. It was, however, in this predilection alone that she betrayed the ambition which formed the leading trait of her character. While thus fitting herself in her childhood for the throne, which as yet she viewed through a vista far remote, she endeavoured to conceal her object by the semblance of the most perfect humility, and affecting a love for the leisure and quiet of private life. Section 2.